Throughout more than 20 years of studying relationship patterns, I have seen avoidant individuals walk away from connections that most people would have considered incredibly rare. I have watched them leave partners who were kind, patient, emotionally available, and sincerely committed. I have seen them distance themselves from people who respected their boundaries, gave them room when they needed it, avoided chasing or forcing closeness, and loved with a quiet consistency that many spend a lifetime hoping to experience. Then, every so often, I have watched those same people who appeared impossible to reach and completely comfortable hiding behind emotional independence meet one very particular kind of person. From that moment, something shifts. The outcome is not always lasting, and it does not always end in a happy reunion, but it creates cracks in their emotional walls unlike anything else I have witnessed. Today I want to talk about that person, and there is a strong possibility that the person I am describing is you. The empath who touches an avoidant at the deepest level is rarely the one who gives the most, sacrifices the most, or works the hardest to earn love. It is not the person who endlessly adapts, constantly reassures, or reshapes themselves to fit whatever makes the avoidant feel comfortable. As caring and admirable as those qualities are, they often have the opposite effect. Instead of making the avoidant feel safer, they can unintentionally activate the instinct to pull away. That happens because the avoidant nervous system has learned to associate emotional closeness with pressure. Whenever love feels as though it comes with expectations, even healthy ones, their protective instincts switch on. A partner who visibly longs for emotional connection, no matter how sincere or loving they are, can be interpreted as someone asking for something the avoidant feels unable or unprepared to provide. Their withdrawal is not always about rejecting the person. More often, it is an attempt to escape the emotional weight they believe they cannot carry. The empath who reaches them in a completely different way possesses something far more powerful than endless patience. They have what I would describe as quiet emotional sovereignty. This is someone who experiences life with remarkable sensitivity, picking up on emotions, energy, and subtle changes that many people overlook. They feel joy deeply, sadness intensely, and the emotions of others with extraordinary clarity. Yet those emotions no longer dictate their actions. They have spent years facing their own pain, healing old wounds, learning difficult lessons, and becoming familiar with every part of themselves, including the pieces they once feared. Because of that inner work, their emotional depth has transformed from something fragile into something incredibly steady. They are compassionate without becoming consumed. They remain open without abandoning themselves. Their sensitivity is no longer a weakness waiting to be exploited. It has become the strongest part of who they are. What makes this person unforgettable to an avoidant is that they do not depend on the relationship to feel emotionally complete. They genuinely care. They love deeply, honestly, and without pretending otherwise. Their warmth is real, their affection is unmistakable, and their willingness to connect is sincere. But their peace does not disappear if those feelings are not immediately returned. They are not desperately waiting for validation or chasing reassurance to feel worthy. Their emotional stability exists independently of another person's choices. They can stand fully in their love without losing themselves if that love is not reciprocated. For an avoidant, this creates an experience they rarely encounter. They meet someone who offers closeness without pressure, intimacy without emotional control, and affection without hidden demands. That combination is unfamiliar because it does not match the relationship patterns their protective system was built to defend against. The reason this dynamic is so powerful is rooted in the very purpose of the avoidant defense system. Those defenses developed to protect against relationships that felt emotionally overwhelming, where closeness seemed to threaten independence, or where expectations felt impossible to satisfy. When they sense pressure, obligation, or emotional dependency, their instinct is to create distance because distance has always felt like safety. But when they encounter someone who is emotionally available without being emotionally dependent, their usual strategies begin to lose their effectiveness. They cannot easily categorize this person as someone who will overwhelm them, yet they cannot dismiss them either. Instead, they are faced with a relationship that quietly challenges everything their protective instincts have taught them. It is in that unfamiliar space that the strongest emotional shifts often begin, because for the first time, their defenses are standing in front of something they were never designed to resist. The avoidance protective system is built to react whenever they sense emotional pressure, especially when another person's happiness seems closely tied to how much closeness they are willing to give. When they step back and the other person immediately moves toward them, their instinct to create even more distance becomes stronger. The more one person pursues, the more the other withdraws, and before long, both people are trapped in a cycle that feels painful, confusing, and emotionally draining. Anyone who has loved an avoidant knows how familiar this pattern becomes. The difference with the emotionally grounded empath is that they do not respond to distance by chasing after reassurance. That does not mean they are unaffected. In truth, they often feel the separation more deeply than almost anyone else. The difference is what they choose to do with those feelings. Instead of looking outward for comfort, they turn inward, reconnect with themselves, and rely on the emotional strength they have spent years building. Because this empath has developed a solid sense of self-worth, they understand that another person's temporary withdrawal does not define their value. They know the avoidant's emotional availability rises and falls for reasons that often have very little to do with their own worthiness. Rather than trying to force reconnection, they remain calm, centered, and emotionally present with themselves. When the avoidant expects pursuit, but instead finds quiet confidence, their usual defensive pattern begins to break down. There is nothing to resist, nothing to escape from, and no emotional pressure confirming the story they have always believed about relationships. They cannot retreat from someone who is not trying to control them. They cannot gain comfort from feeling emotionally less invested because the other person is not seeking validation from them. Instead, they are met with someone who stands peacefully in their own emotional balance. That quiet confidence often becomes one of the most unexpected and unforgettable experiences the avoidant has ever faced. It is important to understand exactly how this type of empath behaves, because the difference is found in everyday actions, not dramatic gestures. This person sees the avoidant exactly as they are. They are not blinded by fantasy or consumed by disappointment. They do not ignore the beautiful moments of connection, nor do they pretend the emotional distance, inconsistency, and avoidance do not exist. They recognize the warmth, the vulnerability, the fear, the contradictions, and the limitations all at once. Instead of swinging between unrealistic hope and bitter resentment, they hold a balanced perspective. They accept what is real without losing compassion. That level of emotional clarity is uncommon because most people either idealize someone they love or eventually become overwhelmed by frustration. This empath manages to stay grounded in reality while keeping their heart open, and that creates an entirely different relationship dynamic. For many avoidants, this kind of acceptance feels unfamiliar because they have spent much of their lives moving between two extremes. At first, they are often placed on a pedestal, admired for qualities that cannot realistically be sustained forever. Eventually, when their emotional distance begins to show, admiration turns into disappointment, criticism, or resentment. They become accustomed to being misunderstood in one direction or the other. Very few people truly see the complete picture without rushing to judge it. When someone understands both their strengths and their struggles, yet continues to interact with kindness instead of condemnation, it shakes the foundation of the emotional walls they have relied upon for years. Those walls were built to protect them from rejection, pressure, disappointment, and anger. But when they encounter someone who understands them clearly without attacking or demanding that they become someone else overnight, those defenses lose much of the purpose they once served. There is another quality that makes this empath especially significant, and it may be the one that reaches the avoidant more deeply than anything else. They have no mission to rescue, repair, or transform the avoidant into a different person. That may sound obvious, but in reality, it is incredibly uncommon. Many caring people believe love means helping someone heal, encouraging constant change, or patiently guiding them toward becoming emotionally available. Even when those intentions come from genuine compassion, they can still communicate that the avoidant is not acceptable as they are right now. The sovereign empath takes a different approach. They believe growth is possible, but they understand it cannot be forced. They offer support without taking responsibility for another person's healing. They create space without trying to manage every emotional outcome. By refusing to become a fixer, they remove yet another layer of pressure, allowing the avoidant to experience a relationship where acceptance is offered freely instead of being tied to expectations or constant attempts to change them. Many people who love an avoidant sincerely believe they are giving them space, but beneath that patience, there is often a quiet expectation. Deep down, they hope that if they wait long enough, love gently enough, and avoid creating conflict, the avoidant will eventually lower their walls. They imagine that one day their partner will become fully emotionally available, openly affectionate, and consistently present. While these hopes usually come from a loving place, they still create an invisible pressure. Avoidants are remarkably sensitive to anything that feels like an expectation, even when it is never spoken aloud. They often recognize that hidden desire for change long before anyone says a word about it. To them, what appears to be acceptance can still feel like a silent request to become someone different. Even when wrapped in kindness, that unspoken agenda can trigger the same defenses they have relied on for years. The emotionally grounded empath is different because they are not quietly waiting for another person to transform. Their acceptance is not a strategy, and their patience is not an investment expecting future returns. They are present because they genuinely choose to be, not because they believe their presence will eventually unlock someone else's emotional walls. They do not measure today's relationship against tomorrow's possibilities. Instead, they meet the avoidant exactly where they are, without secretly wishing they were somewhere else emotionally. There is no invisible contract attached to their kindness, no silent expectation that love must eventually be rewarded with dramatic change. Their care exists without conditions, and that authenticity creates a type of emotional safety the avoidant has rarely, if ever, experienced. It is acceptance in its purest form, offered freely rather than exchanged as part of an unspoken bargain. For someone whose life has been shaped by emotional self-protection, this kind of presence can feel almost impossible to understand. It reaches beyond logic and bypasses the defenses they have spent years perfecting. They may not even have the words to explain why this person affects them so deeply. They simply feel something unfamiliar. Beneath their habitual patterns of withdrawal, beneath the fears that taught them to keep people at a distance, something begins to soften. The experience does not always lead to a lasting relationship or a perfectly happy ending, but it often leaves a permanent mark. Once an avoidant has experienced someone who offers genuine closeness without pressure, control, or hidden expectations, it becomes much harder to believe that every relationship must eventually demand more than they can give. Whether they fully understand it or not, that encounter changes something inside them that rarely returns to its previous state. If you recognize yourself in this description, if you are someone who combines deep emotional sensitivity with inner stability, who loves openly without abandoning yourself, and who can see another person's strengths and limitations with equal honesty, then there is something important you deserve to remember. Your emotional depth has never been the problem. Your capacity to care, to understand, and to remain compassionate is not something that needs to be reduced in order to make others comfortable. Those qualities are not excessive simply because someone else struggled to receive them. The challenge was never that your heart was too large or your love too intense. The challenge was that the person standing across from you had not yet developed the emotional capacity to fully meet what you were offering. Never allow someone else's limitations to convince you that you must become smaller. Do not mistake another person's fear of intimacy for evidence that your love is overwhelming or your needs are unreasonable. The qualities that make you emotionally rich are the same qualities that will be deeply valued by someone capable of genuine connection. Stay rooted in the person you have become through every hardship, every lesson, and every moment of healing. Continue protecting your peace without closing your heart. Continue offering kindness without sacrificing your self-respect. Continue loving from a place of strength instead of fear. The right relationship will never require you to silence your emotional depth or question your worth. Your presence was never excessive. It carried exactly the depth it was meant to carry. The only thing missing was someone whose own emotional growth had reached a place where they could truly recognize it, receive it, and stand beside it without fear. One of the greatest misunderstandings about avoidant attachment is the belief that avoidant people are untouched by deep emotion. From the outside, they often appear calm, independent, and unaffected by conflict or separation. Their ability to create emotional distance can make it seem as though they simply do not care. In reality, many avoidants experience emotions just as intensely as anyone else, but they have learned to manage those feelings by disconnecting from them instead of expressing them. For many, this pattern began long before adulthood. Somewhere along the way, they absorbed the message that vulnerability created pain, that depending on others led to disappointment, or that emotional needs were something to hide rather than share. Over time, emotional suppression stopped being a choice and became an automatic survival strategy. Even when they desperately want closeness, the habits that once protected them continue operating long after the original danger has disappeared. This is why relationships with emotionally healthy people can feel surprisingly uncomfortable for an avoidant. Healthy love asks for honesty, openness, and mutual vulnerability. It creates an environment where emotions are welcomed instead of avoided. While that sounds appealing on the surface, it also requires the avoidant to face parts of themselves they have spent years keeping hidden. Every genuine conversation, every moment of emotional intimacy, and every act of unconditional care quietly invites them to lower the walls they have depended on for safety. That invitation is often interpreted by their nervous system as risk rather than comfort. They may genuinely enjoy being close one day and then suddenly feel an overwhelming urge to create distance the next. This inconsistency is confusing for both partners because it is driven less by conscious choice and more by deeply conditioned emotional responses that developed over many years. The emotionally mature empath often notices this pattern without immediately reacting to it. Instead of assuming every moment of distance means rejection, they understand that human behavior is shaped by experiences that are not always visible. This does not mean they excuse harmful behavior or tolerate endless inconsistency. It simply means they avoid taking every withdrawal as a personal attack on their worth. They recognize the difference between understanding someone's emotional history and becoming responsible for fixing it. That distinction protects them from losing themselves in the relationship. Compassion without boundaries eventually becomes self-neglect, while boundaries without compassion can become emotional detachment. The healthiest empath learns to hold both at the same time. They remain kind without abandoning themselves, patient without becoming passive, and loving without allowing another person's fears to define the quality of their own life. One of the most powerful things the sovereign empath offers is emotional consistency. Avoidants often expect relationships to follow familiar patterns of pursuit, disappointment, criticism, and emotional chaos. When someone responds with calm instead of panic, honesty instead of manipulation, and steadiness instead of emotional games, it creates an experience that challenges their expectations. They slowly begin to realize that closeness does not always come with control, and that love does not always demand the loss of independence. These realizations rarely happen through speeches or persuasion. They happen through repeated experiences where actions consistently communicate safety. Trust is built quietly over time, not because someone argued them into changing, but because they repeatedly experienced a relationship that contradicted the beliefs their defenses had taught them to expect. Even so, it is important to remember that no amount of emotional wisdom can force another person to heal. An avoidant must eventually become willing to examine their own patterns if lasting change is going to happen. Another person's patience, understanding, or unconditional love cannot complete that work for them. Personal growth begins only when someone decides that the emotional walls protecting them are now causing more pain than the vulnerability they were built to prevent. Until that moment arrives, Every relationship will eventually encounter the same invisible barriers, regardless of how loving the other person may be. This truth is not discouraging. It is freeing because it reminds compassionate people that they are responsible for the quality of their own choices, not for carrying someone else's emotional journey on their shoulders. The healthiest relationships are built when both people are committed to growth. The empath brings emotional awareness, openness, and compassion. The avoidant brings curiosity about their own defenses and a willingness to move through discomfort instead of running from it. When those two qualities exist together, remarkable transformation becomes possible, not because one partner rescued the other, but because both people accepted responsibility for their own healing while choosing to support each other along the way. Love becomes a place where two emotionally whole individuals continue growing together, instead of expecting one person to complete what the other has not yet faced. That kind of connection feels peaceful rather than exhausting because it is built on mutual accountability instead of emotional imbalance. Perhaps the most valuable lesson for anyone who loves an avoidant is learning that your greatest strength is not your ability to wait forever or sacrifice endlessly. Your greatest strength is your ability to remain deeply connected to yourself while loving another person. When your peace no longer depends on someone else's emotional availability, your relationships begin to change. You stop chasing certainty because you already possess stability within yourself. You stop interpreting every moment of distance as proof that you are unworthy because your value is no longer measured by another person's ability to express love. Ironically, it is often from that place of inner security that the healthiest relationships become possible. Whether the avoidant grows beside you or chooses another path, you remain rooted in the same truth. Your emotional depth is not a burden to carry. It is one of the greatest strengths you will ever possess when it is guided by wisdom, healthy boundaries, and unwavering self-respect. There is another reason the sovereign empath affects the avoidant so deeply, and it has little to do with what they say. It has everything to do with what they consistently demonstrate. Avoidants are often highly observant. They pay close attention to changes in behavior, shifts in tone, and emotional reactions, even if they rarely acknowledge what they notice. They are accustomed to seeing people become increasingly anxious when distance appears. They expect repeated messages, emotional conversations, attempts to pull them back, or visible disappointment. These responses feel familiar because they reinforce the avoidant's long-standing belief that closeness eventually becomes overwhelming. But when they encounter someone who remains warm without becoming reactive, available without becoming dependent, and caring without trying to force connection, it interrupts the emotional script they have replayed for years. Suddenly, they are faced with a relationship that does not follow the pattern they have learned to expect, and that unfamiliar experience quietly lingers in their mind. Over time, this creates something that many avoidants find surprisingly difficult to ignore. Curiosity begins replacing certainty. Instead of feeling trapped by another person's emotional expectations, they begin wondering why this relationship feels different. They notice that the empath is not withdrawing to punish them, nor pursuing them to regain control. There are no emotional games designed to create guilt or force commitment. The empath simply continues living a meaningful life, caring deeply, while remaining fully connected to their own purpose. For the avoidant, this can awaken emotions they have spent years keeping buried. They begin asking themselves questions they have rarely considered before. Why does this person's absence feel different? Why do I think about them even when they are not reaching out? Why does their calm affect me more than anyone else's pursuit ever did? Those questions mark the beginning of genuine self-reflection, something that cannot be forced from the outside. This is often where many people become confused. They assume that because the avoidant begins reaching out again, everything has changed. In reality, renewed contact does not automatically mean emotional transformation. An avoidant can miss someone deeply while still struggling with the same fears that caused distance in the first place. Feelings alone are not enough to create lasting change. Real growth happens when awareness is followed by responsibility. It requires the avoidant to recognize the protective habits they have relied upon, understand where those habits came from, and consciously choose healthier ways of relating even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Without that commitment, the relationship may simply repeat the same cycle with slightly different timing. The empath understands this. They welcome genuine effort, but they no longer mistake temporary closeness for permanent healing. One of the greatest strengths of the sovereign empath is their ability to let reality guide their decisions instead of hope alone. Hope is beautiful, but when it is disconnected from consistent behavior, it can keep people waiting for years. The emotionally mature empath watches actions more than promises. They appreciate words, but they place greater value on patterns. If the avoidant repeatedly chooses honesty, accountability, and emotional presence, trust naturally grows. If the old cycle continues despite heartfelt apologies, the empath does not ignore what they see. They understand that love without consistency eventually creates confusion instead of security. Because they value themselves, they refuse to build a future on potential alone. They appreciate possibility, but they make decisions based on what is happening now, rather than what might happen someday. This quiet confidence changes the emotional balance of the relationship. The empath is no longer trying to convince someone to love them or prove their worth through endless understanding. They know that healthy love must be chosen freely by both people. If the avoidant steps forward with genuine openness, they are welcomed with warmth. If they continue running from intimacy, the empath allows them the freedom to make that choice without abandoning themselves in the process. There is sadness when necessary, but there is no desperation. There is grief without self-betrayal. There is compassion without sacrificing personal dignity. That balance is incredibly powerful because it communicates something words never could. It says, "I can love you deeply, and I can also survive without you." Few messages challenge an avoidant's assumptions more than that quiet truth. In the end, the relationship becomes a mirror for both people. The avoidant is invited to examine the fears that have kept genuine intimacy at a distance, while the empath is invited to strengthen the boundaries that protect their own emotional well-being. Neither person's healing depends entirely on the other, yet both have the opportunity to grow through the connection. Sometimes they grow together, creating a relationship built on honesty, trust, and emotional maturity. Other times they grow separately, carrying the lessons into future relationships that are better aligned with who they have become. Either outcome has value because true growth is never measured only by whether two people stay together. It is measured by whether they leave the experience more self-aware, more emotionally grounded, and more capable of giving and receiving love in a healthier way than before.